Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that takes a complex stack of sources and delivers the absolute essential knowledge directly to you. Our mission today is to decode one of the most romanticized yet profoundly tragic figures in 20th century literature, Ernest Hemingway.
We are charting the remarkable, almost unbelievably dramatic life of Ernest Miller Hemingway, born in 1899 and deceased in 1961. And we're synthesizing a life that was just one long, continuous exercise in physical and emotional extremes.
Right.
The real challenge here is figuring out what fueled his masterpieces, what made his writing so lean, so powerful, and why that same life ended in such devastation.
That duality is the foundation of the myth, isn't it?
Right.
Hemingway's this iconic contradiction. You have the high-octane public brand,
Yeah.
the romanticized adventurer, the big game hunter in Africa, the deep-sea fisherman, the, hard-drinking war correspondent.
Exactly. He's the figure who was decorated for bravery in World War I, owned a legendary boat called the Pilar, and married 4 times.
That's the outward projection, the performance you give the world.
But here's the crucial counterpoint. The thing he is ultimately famous for, his actual prose, is, well, it's economical, it's surgical, and profoundly understated. He pioneered a style based almost entirely on omission.
So he was this colossal, loud personality who wrote quiet, distilled fiction. And that unique style, what we know as the Iceberg Theory, exerted such a massive influence that it earned him the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1953.
And the following year, the Nobel Prize in Literature. And that was an acknowledgement not just of his technical mastery of narrative, but of the indelible mark he had left on contemporary literary style.
So today we're peeling back the myth to understand the methodology.
We'll trace the biography chronologically, moving from the affluent conservative suburbs of his youth right into the crucible of war. Then we'll dissect how that early trauma, coupled with later almost unbelievable catastrophic injuries, resulted in his revolutionary technique, his commitment to showing, never telling, and ultimately his tragic final years.
Okay, let's unpack the beginning. Ernest was born July 21st, 1899 in Oak Park, Illinois. And it's really important to understand the setting here.
Yeah.
Oak Park was an affluent, deeply conservative suburb known for its strict morality.
Oh, completely. It was a place where conformity was the highest value. I think Frank Lloyd Wright, who had his famous studio there, he famously described Oak Park as having so many churches for so many good people to go to.
Right.
For a young Hemingway, this environment just represented a certain suffocating rigidity.
And his parents were the embodiment of this split. I mean, they were educated and well-respected, but their interests pulled him in these radically different directions.
Absolutely. On one side, you had his mother, Grace Hall Hemingway, a well-known local musician. She taught him the cello.
Which he hated, right?
He later claimed to despise the cello lessons, viewing them as an attempt to mold him into a passive, artistic boy. However, and this is key, he did credit those lessons with contributing to the contrapuntal structure of his complex narrative in the later novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls.
So that idea of layered, interwoven narratives.
Yeah.
That comes from music.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have his father, Dr. Clarence Hemingway, who was pulling him toward the wild. Clarence instilled this lifelong passion for the outdoors, teaching him woodcraft, hunting, fishing, and camping at the family's summer cottage in northern Michigan.
This is critical. These early experiences established the 2 poles of his personality.
Yes, the refined artist struggling against the perceived conventionality of home, and the rugged outdoorsman finding authenticity and solitude in the wilderness. And the wilderness became his primary refuge, a concept that would, define his life and his fiction.
But before the wilderness became a theme, his professional style was set in stone by the city. Right after high school, he worked for just 6 months as a cub reporter for the Kansas City Star.
And that short stint became the foundational experience for his literary technique. The Star's style guide was almost a moral code for writing. They demanded clarity, brevity, and strength.
And these weren't just suggestions, they were dictates. The specific rules, which sound exactly like the blueprint for a Hemingway novel, were:
use short sentences. Use short first paragraphs.
Use vigorous English. Be positive, not negative.
It's amazing when you think about it, the entire structure of the Iceberg Theory, the economy, the declarative sentences, the reliance on dialogue and action was born not in Paris cafes,
but in the rigorous, disciplined environment of a Midwestern newspaper office.
Right. It trained him to strip away all the unnecessary adjectives and elaborate description, favoring impact and velocity above all else.
So we have the technique established. Now let's connect that style directly to the life-changing trauma of World War I, because that provided the emotional fuel for the technique. He desperately wanted to enlist in the U.S. Army, but was rejected.
Yes, because of poor eyesight. So he volunteered as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross and arrived on the Italian front in May 1918. He was still only 18 years old. And his romantic notions of war, which were typical of young men at the time, were instantly brutally obliterated.
Tell us about that first day in Milan. It sounds absolutely visceral.
It was horrific. He was immediately sent to the site of a munitions factory explosion where he joined rescuers retrieving the remains of female workers. He described the incident later in Death in the Afternoon, using that stark, detached language that the Star taught him, saying they simply collected fragments.
Collected fragments, just wow.
That immediate, brutal confrontation with death and dismemberment happening before he even saw the front lines was a massive psychological shock.
And just a month later, on July 8th, 1918, he was severely wounded himself. He was delivering supplies at Fussalta di Piave when a mortar shell exploded nearby.
He was seriously wounded in the legs by shrapnel, but what followed is pure Hemingway code. Despite his severe injuries, over 200 fragments were reportedly pulled from his legs. He assisted Italian soldiers who were more seriously wounded than he was to safety.
That act of bravery earned him immediate recognition: the Italian War Merit Cross and the Silver Medal of Military Valor. The citation praised his admirable spirit of brotherhood, but the cost psychologically must have been immense.
It was the loss of illusion. He later famously said that going to war as a boy gives you a great illusion of immortality. He said he lost that illusion the moment he was badly wounded and knew that killing could happen to him, that he was mortal.
And that moment of clarity, that lost innocence, is foundational to every character he wrote thereafter who faces the chaos of the world.
And while recuperating for 6 months in Milan, the emotional scarring continued. He fell in love with Agnes von Kurowski, a nurse 7 years his senior. This relationship, which he believed would lead to marriage, ended in a devastating rejection. Well, she led him on, and he returned home in January 1919 believing they would marry. Then, she sent a letter revealing she was engaged to an Italian officer. It established this painful pattern that would haunt his romantic life. He often repeated that cycle of abandoning a wife or finding a reason to leave before he could be abandoned himself.
A preemptive strike against emotional vulnerability.
Exactly.
His return home in 1919 was deeply complicated. He was barely 20, physically and psychologically damaged, and his war-forged maturity was completely at odds with the conservative, innocent life of Oak Park.
The biographer Michael Reynolds noted the specific emotional difficulty. He couldn't articulate the trauma to his parents, he couldn't tell them how scared he was, or what it was like to face surgeons who couldn't tell him in English if his leg was going to be amputated. The language of traditional sentiment just failed him.
And this is where the trauma connects back to the style. The traditional narrative failed, so he sought a new one. That September, he took a fishing and camping trip to Michigan's Upper Peninsula.
Exactly. This retreat became the inspiration for the story Big Two-Hearted River, where the semi-autobiographical character Nick Adams seeks solitude after returning from war. The story is a perfect example of the iceberg theory in action. The surface action is the intense physical process of fishing, but the true meaning, the war trauma, is submerged and omitted.
He's controlling the external world because he cannot control the internal emotional chaos.
Precisely.
He eventually moved to Chicago, met and married Hadley Richardson in 1921. Hadley was 8 years older, and our sources suggest she had a nurturing instinct, possibly a reflection of the security he craved after Agnes's rejection, though she was characterized as less mature than Agnes.
Right. And it was Sherwood Anderson, whom he met in Chicago, who convinced them to skip Rome and head straight to Paris, providing the key letters of introduction. With Hadley, Hemingway achieved stability, a comfortable income from her trust fund, and a life in Europe. The stage was set for the creation of a literary revolution.
Paris, the early 1920s. This is the literary launchpad. He arrived, working as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star, but his real work was absorbing the artistic ferment of the Montparnasse Quarter.
It was an electric time. I mean, Paris in the 1920s was the intellectual capital of the West. The expatriate community, which Gertrude Stein coined the lost generation, was absolutely critical to his development. He met literary heavyweights, artists, thinkers, defining his place in modernism.
Stein was his major mentor. She was the absolute epicenter of the movement, introducing him to artists like Pablo Picasso and the entire circle of expatriate modernists. She even became godmother to his son, Jack.
Her influence was profound, particularly in encouraging him to focus on the unique rhythms and voices of American English, stripped of European ornamentation. But, as we know, the relationship didn't last. Once Hemingway achieved success, their connection deteriorated into this decades-long, bitter literary quarrel, often fueled by personal jealousy and professional competitiveness.
He also found an advocate in Ezra Pound, who was 14 years his senior. Pound recognized and fostered his young, raw talent, introducing him to James Joyce.
It's fascinating how quickly he integrated into the elite. Hemingway and Joyce would frequently embark on alcoholic sprees, solidifying his reputation among the avant-garde. This rapid ascent shows that the foundational discipline from the Kansas City Star was already translating into compelling material.
But then catastrophe struck. In December 1922, we have the disaster of the lost manuscripts. Hadley was traveling from Paris to meet him in Geneva and somehow lost a suitcase at the Gare de Lyon.
And that suitcase contained everything. Almost all of his early fiction, short stories, and manuscripts. It was complete destruction of his professional portfolio. Hemingway was, understandably furious with Hadley and utterly devastated by the loss.
How did that monumental loss impact his writing style? It feels like the second major trauma following World War I that forced a stylistic choice.
It's the second crucible. The WWI trauma taught him to omit emotional pain. The loss of the manuscripts taught him to omit wasteful words. It reinforced his commitment to precise, spare writing that could not afford to be overwritten. If he had to start his entire career over, every sentence had to be perfect, every word essential. This loss solidified his commitment to the radical economy that became the Iceberg Theory.
He returned to writing furiously, and his career gained momentum rapidly. His first collection, 3 stories and 10 poems, came out in 1923. Then in our time in 1924, which included vignettes inspired by his first visit to Spain, where he discovered bullfighting the corrida.
The corrida became another essential pillar of his aesthetic. He saw in bullfighting a ritualistic, authentic confrontation with death, stripped of pretense. It was of great tragic interest, being literally of life and death, as he would later analyze. It became the perfect manifestation of the code hero facing death with dignity.
His 1925 collection, In Our Time, with stories like Indian Camp, that marked the moment the American reading public realized this young writer was doing something truly revolutionary. His use of dialogue and short declarative sentences reinvigorated the short story genre.
And then F. Scott Fitzgerald. In 1925, they met and formed this friendship characterized by intense admiration coupled with intense hostility and competition. After Hemingway read the proofs of The Great Gatsby, he recognized the scope of novelistic ambition and decided his next work had to be a novel.
And that novel, The Sun Also Rises, became the immediate voice of a generation. The inspiration came from his third trip to the Festival of San Fermin in Pamplona. He began writing the draft on his birthday, July 24, 1925, and finished it an astonishing 8 weeks later.
Published in 1926, it was immediately recognized as his greatest work to date. It epitomized the post-war expatriate lost generation defined by Jake Barnes and Lady Brett Ashley. The characters are spiritually and often physically wounded, wandering, finding solace only in ritual and fleeting moments of connection.
But what's fascinating is Hemingway's insistence that the book's point wasn't simply that the generation was lost. He argued that the earth abideth forever, meaning while the characters were battered, they were grounded in the timeless reality of nature and ritual. They endured.
Yet the central theme of spiritual and physical emasculation, epitomized by Jake Barnes's war wound, is a direct reflection of Hemingway's own deepest trauma. The wound is mentioned, but it's never detailed or emotionally explored. It is pure iceberg theory. We feel the effect of the wound on his life and relationships, not the wound itself.
While achieving this literary success, his first marriage deteriorated because of his affair with Pauline Pfeiffer, a wealthy Vogue journalist. Pauline was much more commercially ambitious for him, even urging him to sign a contract with Scribner's against Hadley's advice.
And that pattern of preemptive abandonment resurfaced. Hadley learned of the affair, asked for a separation, and they divorced in January 1927. The financial arrangement was telling. Hadley, by contract, took the future proceeds from The Sun Also Rises. Hemingway married Pauline quickly in May, converting to Catholicism beforehand to appease her family.
This shift marked the end of his Great Paris period. They left in March 1928, primarily because Pauline was pregnant. But just before they departed, he suffered yet another concussion, a constant pattern in his life. He mistakenly pulled down a skylight in their Paris bathroom, thinking the chain was for the toilet.
That injury left him with a prominent forehead scar he carried for life. And after this incident, he made a conscious choice to move away from the chaos of modern urban life. As our sources state, he never again lived in a big city.
The relocation led them to Key West, Florida, by way of Kansas City, where their son Patrick was born in June 1928. And Pauline had a difficult delivery, which later served as a direct inspiration for the tragic birth scene in his next major novel, A Farewell to Arms.
Then, the profound personal tragedy of December 1928. Hemingway received the news that his father, Dr. Clarence, had killed himself with his father's Civil War pistol.
This event was devastating. It provided a shocking, fatal parallel to the suicide of Hadley's father decades earlier. The trauma of WWI had been externalized, but this was internal and hereditary.
And his reaction was chillingly prescient. He reportedly said, "I'll probably go the same way." This experience cemented suicide, depression, and the struggle against family fate as a dark, permanent undercurrent in his subsequent work. He knew, consciously or subconsciously, the tragic path that might await him.
So now we enter Act 3, the period that defined him as a major American writer, starting with A Farewell to Arms in 1929. He had finished the draft months earlier, but the obsessive, meticulous Hemingway spent months refining it.
This attention to detail is crucial. He famously rewrote the ending as many as 17 times.
17 times. Why?
Because the ending, the tragic death of the woman he loves, Catherine Barkley, during childbirth, was the ultimate moment of omitted emotion. He needed to find the exact sequence of words, the exact cadence, the perfect collection of facts that would trigger the profound, inescapable grief in the reader without him ever having to use a single sentimental adjective.
A Farewell to Arms cemented his stature as a complex, mature American voice. Critics recognized a level of thematic complexity and depth that went far beyond the post-war disillusionment of The Sun Also Rises.
He then immersed himself again in Spain and the philosophy of the Corda, resulting in the 1932 nonfiction treatise, Death in the Afternoon. This was not merely a book about bullfighting, it was an attempt to articulate his aesthetic philosophy.
He argued that bullfighting was a ritual that revealed deep truths about courage, skill, grace under pressure, and the inevitability of death. It was the perfect real-life example of the code hero, the professional who maintains dignity and authenticity in the face of oblivion.
The early 1930s established his geographical pattern: winters in Key West, which offered the seclusion he loved, and summers in Wyoming, hunting elk and grizzly bear. He found Wyoming the most beautiful country he had seen in the American West. This lifestyle wasn't just a hobby, it was a necessary counterweight to the emotional and intellectual demands of his writing.
In 1934, he purchased his legendary fishing boat, the Pillar, using the name of the woman in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Though the boat's name predates the novel, which is interesting, this boat represented absolute freedom, another self-contained world where he controlled the process and the output.
But his taste for extreme experience naturally led him to Africa. In 1933, he and Pauline went on a 10-week safari to Kenya, and this trip was purely for material generation, feeding his insatiable need for authentic experience to write about.
That trip provided the material for the nonfiction travelogue Green Hills of Africa and two of his greatest short stories, The Snows of Kilimanjaro and The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber.
And even that trip resulted in another brush with death. While there, he contracted amoebic dysentery, which became so severe he required evacuation by plane to Nairobi. That near-death experience, the writer confronting mortality, reviewing his life and failures, is directly reflected in the story The Snows of Kilimanjaro. His life was constantly feeding and sometimes consuming his fiction.
The next major crucible was the Spanish Civil War. He began covering it in 1937 for the North American Newspaper Alliance, accurately predicting that the conflict was a testing ground for a broader European war.
This period also saw him meet Martha Gellhorn, a brilliant war correspondent and journalist who would become his third wife. Their relationship was forged in the heat and danger of the conflict.
But the war also caused a major political and personal fracture that is critical to understanding Hemingway's commitment to the cause. He replaced John Dos Passos as screenwriter for the propaganda film The Spanish Earth.
Right, and Dos Passos abruptly left the project because his friend and Spanish translator, José Robles, was arrested and executed by the Republican side. This execution shattered Dos Passos' belief in the leftist cause, causing a profound, lasting rift with Hemingway, who remained committed to the Republican anti-fascist effort.
That's a fascinating conflict because Dos Passos felt betrayed by the cause, but Hemingway felt the cause was greater than individual grievances. How does that square with Hemingway's professed value for personal integrity and authenticity?
It reveals the complexity of the code hero when confronting politics. For Hemingway, the larger externalized conflict, fascism versus democracy, created a moral landscape as stark and clear as the corrida. The political choice, for him, became the authentic choice, even if it meant betraying a friendship or overlooking specific Republican atrocities, like Roble's murder. It was a commitment to the big picture.
That war formed the foundation for his massive novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, from 1940, written largely at the Finca Villa in Cuba, which he rented after separating from Pauline.
That book was a cultural phenomenon. It triumphantly reestablished Hemingway's literary reputation after the struggles of the mid-30s, selling 500,000 copies within months. It demonstrated that he could handle large-scale political and moral conflicts while still maintaining the spare, powerful prose he pioneered.
And the pattern continued. Divorce Pauline, marry Martha Gellhorn in 1940, and relocate again, splitting time between Cuba and Sun Valley, Idaho. He was a writer who viewed geographical relocation as essential for his artistic reset after major life events.
After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, World War II followed him to Cuba. He immediately refitted the Pilar as a Q-boat to patrol for German U-boats off the coast, essentially running an amateur maritime intelligence operation.
And this is where his life becomes truly tangled with the surveillance state. He created a counterintelligence unit, nicknamed the Crook Factory, headquartered in his guest house, to surveil phalangists and Nazi sympathizers in Havana.
But here's the absurdity. While Hemingway is actively trying to hunt U-boats for the U.S. government, the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, began watching him. They compiled a 124-page file that continued right up until his death.
It's the ultimate paradox. He's hunting Nazis for America, and J. Edgar Hoover suspects him of being a potential subversive. He was the subject of the very sort of paranoid surveillance he would later fear in his final declining years.
Meanwhile, his marriage to Martha Gellhorn was dissolving due to constant fighting, primarily because he refused to return to Europe, preferring to run his amateur war in the Caribbean. Their relationship was defined by conflict, often over his increasing drinking and self-centered focus on the Q-boat mission.
He eventually did return to Europe in 1944, becoming a frontline correspondent for Collier's. But upon arriving in London, he suffered another severe head injury, a concussion, in a car accident.
It's just a remarkable string of physical trauma: WWI shrapnel, the Paris skylight accident, the African dysentery, and now this severe car accident. He met Mary Welsh, a Time correspondent in London, while recuperating and, characteristically, asked her to marry him on their third meeting.
Despite the fresh head wound, he accompanied troops during the Normandy landings. The military viewed him as precious cargo, however, and kept him from going ashore.
The most ethically ambiguous event of his war period came later in France. He attached himself to the 22nd Infantry Regiment and effectively became a de facto leader of a small militia group in Rambouillet, acting far beyond the role of a journalist.
He was brought up on formal charges for contravening the Geneva Convention, which forbids non-combatants from leading military actions. His defense: he claimed he beat the rap by saying he only offered advice. This willingness to cross professional and ethical lines in pursuit of the ultimate authentic frontline experience was pure Hemingway.
He was present for the liberation of Paris, where he visited Sylvia Beach and, in a symbolic moment, forgave Gertrude Stein. He was awarded the Bronze Star in 1947 for being under fire in combat areas in order to obtain an accurate picture of conditions. He divorced Martha and married Mary Welsh in 1946.
The post-war years, 1946 to 1952, were defined by a massive creative slump and health crisis. He suffered from debilitating headaches, high blood pressure, weight problems, and diabetes, all aggravated by his history of accidents and heavy drinking.
This slump was compounded by grief. Many of his literary contemporaries and friends, Fitzgerald Stein, his editor Max Perkins, died during this period. He sank into depression, feeling out of business as a writer, and stalled on lengthy, complex projects like The Garden of Eden and his expansive The Sea Book trilogy.
The Sea Book trilogy later became Islands in the Stream.
Right. That's right. But at the time, he just couldn't finish it. And this creative block climaxed with the critical flop of Across the River and Into the Trees in 1950, a novel inspired by a platonic love affair with a 19-year-old named Adriana Ivancic in Venice. The book was met with scathing reviews.
They suggested his style had become a self-parody.
And that critical failure, predictably, unleashed his fury. Raging at the critics and desperate to prove his continued mastery, he channeled his energy into a single, concise work. He wrote the draft of The Old Man and the Sea in just 8 weeks.
He knew he had reclaimed his territory. He proclaimed it the best I can write ever for all of my life. and he was right.
It was an immediate international sensation. Published in its entirety in Life magazine, it sold millions of copies. It secured the Pulitzer Prize in May 1953 and reestablished him not just as a writer, but as a living cultural monument leading directly into the final tumultuous decade.
The year 1954 started with what should have been the final, definitive end to Hemingway's life. Not once, but twice. While on safari in Africa with Mary, he was almost fatally injured in 2 successive plane crashes, only days apart.
The first crash happened while they were on a sightseeing flight over the Belgian Congo. The plane struck an abandoned utility pole, shearing off the wing. Hemingway sustained injuries to his back and shoulder. They crash-landed and spent a night in the bush, waiting for rescue.
And they chartered a second flight for evacuation, and that one was even worse.
Much worse. When the pilot attempted a landing on a rough airstrip, the plane burst into flames. Mary and the pilot managed to escape through a window, but Hemingway, already severely hurt, had to smash his way out by battering the door open with his head.
With his head. You just can't make this stuff up.
Yeah.
Think about that accumulation of trauma.
Okay.
He suffered 9 known serious concussions over his life.
And the 2 plane crashes resulted in a series of catastrophic injuries. 2 cracked discs, a ruptured kidney and liver, a dislocated shoulder, and a broken skull.
The sheer drama of it was international news. Reporters covered the story of his death. He literally briefed the global press in Entebbe while still battered and bruised, proving the rumors of his demise were greatly exaggerated.
But the physical toll was irreversible, and it created a devastating cycle. To combat the intense chronic pain from the cracked discs, the internal ruptures, and the broken skull, he drank more heavily than ever. The self-medication accelerated his physical and mental decline.
Then came the ultimate validation amid the wreckage. The Nobel Prize in Literature in October 1954, awarded for his mastery of the art of narrative and for the influence that he has exerted on contemporary style.
Still physically recovering, he declined to travel to Stockholm. He sent a speech that stands as one of the most honest summations of his writing philosophy and the danger of celebrity.
What stands out in that Nobel address is the focus on the profound loneliness required for serious artistic creation, especially when you contrast it with the public spectacle his life had become.
He stated that writing, at its best, is a lonely life. He grows in public stature as he sheds his loneliness, and often his work deteriorates. For he does his work alone, and if he is a good enough writer, he must face eternity, or the lack of it, each day. He saw the Hemingway myth as a threat to the Hemingway writer.
But fate offered a brief artistic reprieve in 1956. While staying in Paris, he was reminded of several trunks he had stored at the Ritz Hotel since 1928, and they were finally retrieved.
The trunks were a treasure trove filled with notebooks and writing from his early Paris years. He was thrilled by this recovery of his past, and he immediately began shaping that material into his famous memoir, A Movable Feast. It was the older writer revisiting the younger, simpler man.
This led to a final desperate writing frenzy in 1959. He finished A Movable Feast, expanded his African journal True at First Light to a monumental 200,000 words, added chapters to the Garden of Eden, and worked on Islands in the Stream.
What's tragic is that these massive manuscripts were written while his health was rapidly failing. They were stored in a Havana bank vault, but his time in Cuba was ending due to the political instability under the Castro government.
They bought a home near Ketchum, Idaho in 1959. They left Cuba on July 25, 1960, due to fears of the Castro government nationalizing American property. He left art and those manuscripts in the bank vault, which were later expropriated after the Bay of Pigs invasion. The loss of that unedited material was a severe blow to a man whose memory was already beginning to fail.
In Idaho, the final decline was swift and terrifying. He tried to edit the massive manuscript for the bullfighting articles commissioned by Life magazine, what became The Dangerous Summer. But for the first time in his professional life, he found he could not organize his writing.
A.E. Hotchner, his close friend and biographer, found him unusually hesitant, disorganized, and confused. The man who had based his career on intellectual clarity and precise structure was losing the ability to edit his own thoughts.
He began suffering from severely failing eyesight and intense debilitating paranoia, believing the FBI was actively monitoring his movements in Ketchum.
What's deeply ironic is that while the paranoia seemed delusional to his wife, it was partially true. The FBI had compiled that 124-page file on him since World War II, and an agent was monitoring him in the late 1950s and documented his subsequent stay at the Mayo Clinic. His fear, rooted in past reality, became present delusion.
Mary was unable to cope with his deteriorating state. In late 1960, he was flown to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, treated for severe depression and hypertension.
Doctors suggested his state might have been caused by long-term use of Reserpine and Ritalin, coupled with his genetic and physical history. He underwent 10 to 15 electroconvulsive therapy sessions, or ECT, a common, though controversial, treatment for severe depression at the time.
The ECT treatment aimed to alleviate his depression, but destroyed his greatest asset, his memory. He lamented the outcome, saying, "What is the sense of ruining my head and erasing my memory, which is my capital, and putting me out of business? It was a brilliant cure, but we lost the patient."
Released in ruins in late June 1961, 2 days later, in the early morning hours of July 6, 1961, he quite deliberately used his favorite 12-gauge shotgun in the foyer of his Ketchum home.
His wife, Mary, initially told the press it was accidental, but later confirmed it was suicide. However, the tragedy must be viewed through the lens of modern medical context.
Right. Medical records later confirmed he had been diagnosed with hereditary hemochromatosis in early 1961, which is excessive iron accumulation that culminates in mental and physical deterioration.
And of course, the chilling family history. His father, his sister Ursula, and his brother Lester also died by suicide, proving his 1928 prediction tragically correct.
Furthermore, modern neuropsychiatrists hypothesize that the cumulative effect of those 9 serious concussions, from the WWI shrapnel, the Paris skylight, the London car crash, and the 2 African plane crashes, likely resulted in chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, possibly leading to dementia with Lewy bodies. This physical destruction explains the paranoia, the disorganization, and the ultimate inevitable decline. Let's pivot now from the chaos of the life to the surgical precision of the craft, because the two are inextricably linked. His style is his greatest legacy. It's that lean, hard, athletic narrative prose that completely changed the nature of American writing, building on the tradition of Mark Twain and Stephen Crane.
Hemingway, along with other modernists, reacted against the elaborate, heavily descriptive 19th century style. They felt World War I had used up words. They wanted to create a fiction where meaning wasn't stated explicitly, but was established through dialogue, through action, and most powerfully, through silence.
This brings us back to his famous concept, the Iceberg Theory, or the theory of omission. Only 1/8 of the iceberg floats above the water. The facts, the dialogue, the surface action, the supporting structure, the symbolism, and the emotional weight operate out of sight, beneath the surface.
And critically, this theory was not an excuse for lazy or simplistic writing. Hemingway was clear on the essential test. If a writer of prose knows enough of what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them.
If the writer omits things because he doesn't know them, he only makes hollow places. The mastery lies in knowing the depth of the submerged structure, even if you never show it.
The perfect early example, as we discussed, is Nick Adams fishing in Big Two-Hearted River. The intense surface action of the fishing is the 1/8 above the water. The submerged 7/8 is Nick concentrating so completely on the physical task that he does not have to consciously process the psychological horror of his war trauma. The omission is the whole point.
The syntactic techniques he employed were masterful and revolutionary. About 70% of his sentences are simple declarative sentences. He fundamentally avoided complicated syntax and heavy punctuation, favoring short, sharp sentences that created a photographic snapshot style, akin to journalistic reportage.
He also perfected the use of polysyndeton, the habitual use of the conjunction and in place of commas or other subordinating clauses. It creates a sense of immediacy and relentless motion, linking disparate elements together without pausing for reflection.
A great example is the famous opening passage of A Farewell to Arms. In the bed of the river there were pebbles and boulders, dry and white in the sun, and the water was clear and swiftly moving and blue in the channels, and the houses were wet and the gardens were dusty.
Notice how the constant driving use of "and" juxtaposes these disparate elements, the dry, white pebbles next to the swiftly moving water, the wet houses next to the dusty gardens. It forces the reader to absorb the scene whole, creating a sense of relentless photographic reality without judgment or elaborate description.
And this leads directly to his use of the objective correlative, conveying emotion not through explicit expression, not by saying Nick was depressed, but through a collage of images. He aimed to tell only what happened, but ensured the sequence of motion and fact would inevitably create the intended emotion in the reader, making the story valid always. This was a core technique shared with Pound, Eliot, and Joyce.
Looking at his core themes, they're all landscapes forged by his personal experience: love, war, wilderness, and loss.
Nature, specifically, serves a profound redemptive function. Mountains, streams, and wilderness are places for rebirth and rest where the hunter or fisherman might achieve transcendence at the moment of the kill. It is a world of ritual and control, often presented as a masculine refuge where men exist without the complications of modern urban life or feminine demands.
He also pioneered what we can call the transnational archetype. Because of his constant travel and expatriation, his characters are often multilingual and bicultural, integrating cultural norms from host communities like Spain, Cuba, or France. The foreign settings are not exotic backdrops. They are motivating factors for the characters who are seeking a more authentic, less conventional way of life.
And of course, the theme of death and authenticity permeates his work. The underlying code hero belief is that those who face death with dignity and courage live an authentic life. Francis Macomber, in The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber, for example, only finds true happiness in his final hours, when he overcomes his cowardice and faces danger authentically, just before he dies.
The bullfighter, the soldier, the fisherman, they all represent this struggle. They are judged by how they act under pressure, how they maintain control and dignity when all external forces and even internal emotions are collapsing.
Finally, we must touch on the complicated gender dynamics. Emasculation is a prevalent theme, often linked to the psychological wounding of post-WWI soldiers like Jake Barnes and the simultaneous emancipation of women.
Early critics often lauded his strictly male-centric world, while feminist critics often attacked him as misogynistic, dividing women into simplistic categories like castrators or love slaves.
But the sources suggest a deeper complexity. Recent reevaluations show his sensitivity to gender issues, questioning the assumption that his writing was one-sidedly masculine. Characters like Brett Ashley are incredibly complex, embodying both the tragedy and the freedom of post-war womanhood, rather than just simple antagonists. His goal was to present the authentic friction between men and women operating in a world where old social rules had collapsed.
His influence, however, transcends thematic arguments. His style, that stark, powerful economy, is his absolute greatest legacy, forcing subsequent writers, even those who despise his politics or his persona, to consciously choose either to emulate it or to avoid it entirely.
He became the cultural spokesperson for the post-WWI generation. And because the drama of his life was so extreme, the details became a prime vehicle for exploitation, resulting in the enduring, profitable Hemingway industry we see today.
That influence stretched across generations. J.D. Salinger corresponded with him during WWII, joking that he was the national chairman of the Hemingway fan clubs. And sadly, the tragic legacy continued, with his granddaughter, supermodel Margot Hemingway, whose death was also ruled as suicide.
It's important to note the wealth of posthumous works, too. Mary Hemingway donated his papers to the JFK Library, allowing us to see the full scope of his output. Works like A Movable Feast, his Paris memoir, Islands in the Stream, and the expanded African journal True at First Light all demonstrate that even in his later years he was constantly generating and shaping material, often without the meticulous editing that defined his early success. So let's synthesize the deepest takeaways from this complex life. Hemingway's unique, sparse prose, The Iceberg, was not an arbitrary artistic choice. It was a direct, necessary coping mechanism.
It was developed from the rigid writing rules of his youth and was profoundly refined by the necessity to omit the immense, inarticulable trauma he experienced. The WWI injury, the loss of his early manuscripts, and his father's suicide. The style was a shield.
And we must acknowledge the profound physical toll that undermined that shield. The multiple concussions, the severe shrapnel wounds, and the African plane crashes, injuries that were so bad he was repeatedly reported dead, contributed significantly to his ultimate mental decline, complicated further by genetics, hemochromatosis, and chronic drinking.
Ultimately, he permanently altered American literature by valuing action, dialogue, and potent silence over descriptive excess. He taught writers the fundamental enduring power of economy.
But here's the irony to leave you with, something to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Hemingway defined authenticity and faced death with courage and dignity throughout his fiction. He prized that quiet strength beneath the surface, that knowledge of what was omitted.
Yet, in his final years, his actual life was completely overwhelmed by the very chaos, physical pain, and despair he sought to conquer or omit in his writing. The physical destruction of his brain and body left him without the very mental clarity, his capital, that allowed him to create the code hero in the first place.
We suggest you explore one of his newly rediscovered posthumous works, particularly A Movable Feast. It's a look at the later Hemingway trying to wrestle with and shape his own past long after the style that made him famous had been set in stone. We hope you gained a new perspective on the complex man behind the myth. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.